Hey everyone! Tonight we're drifting back to a world lit only by oil lamps and firelight. A world where the sound of a church bell rolling across the countryside meant you were either being called to prayer, being summoned to work, or being told someone's entire existence had just been rearranged by a marriage contract they definitely did not negotiate. Settle in, dim the lights, and let your thoughts drift. Because tonight, we're exploring why medieval women dreaded their wedding nights. Gently, slowly, and without the slightest rush. It's almost peaceful, isn't it? Knowing that you're listening from the comfort of a soft bed, while medieval brides slept under heavy wool blankets that were scratchy enough to exfoliate an entire village. But let's drift on. The thing about medieval marriage is that it wasn't a love story. Or at least, not usually. Love was something that happened accidentally. The way someone might accidentally drop a loaf of rye bread onto a muddy street, and then watch a dog run off with it. It was an unpredictable bonus, an optional garnish on an already overwhelming plate of obligations. For most noble women, and honestly, for many village women too, marriage was an assignment, and the wedding night was the first exam. Imagine being 12 or 14 or, on a lucky day, maybe 17, and being told, "Tonight you officially become a wife." No gentle explanations. No comforting mothers. No Pinterest boards of flower arrangements. Just a quiet knowledge that your role in your husband's lineage will begin the moment the door shut. And so, of course, medieval women dreaded their wedding nights. They dreaded everything surrounding them. The rituals, the pressure, the expectations, the complete lack of information, and the fact that whatever happened would be judged, not privately, but publicly. Sometimes very publicly. Let's drift backwards a little and step into the life of an aristocratic bride. Her entire existence, from the moment she could walk, was shaped by alliances. She learned to sit quietly, to speak only when spoken to embroider as if her life depended on it, which it sort of did because being accomplished made her slightly more marketable. Her marriage was usually arranged before she finished childhood, sometimes before she finished her letters. The groom might be older, younger, or simply someone who looked permanently confused about why he existed. This was not unusual. And when the marriage negotiations were complete, the dowry measured, the estates listed, the political implications analyzed, it was time for the ceremony. The medieval wedding was equal parts holy sacrament and economic merger. A little like merging two moderately stable but always slightly suspicious family-owned businesses. The bride walked down the aisle not to the happy hum of a wedding march, but to murmuring of villagers counting how many people had shown up. In small communities, weddings were public entertainment. Remember, this is an era with no Netflix, no radio, no pub karaoke. A wedding was an event so exciting that children would talk about it for months afterward, the way modern kids talk about theme parks. But the ceremony was only the beginning. Because after the feasting, the music, the dancing, and the cheerful toasting came the part everyone pretended not to care about, but absolutely cared about. The bedding. Ah, yes. The medieval bedding ceremony. A tradition so intrusive that modern wedding planners should probably never hear about it, or they might try to revive it ironically. The newlyweds were escorted to their chamber by friends, relatives, sometimes clergy. Sometimes a local nobleman who had appointed himself the overseer of all things awkward. In upper-class weddings, people watched as the couple was tucked into bed, not metaphorically, literally tucked in, like infants who had accidentally grown into adult bodies. The guests then left or pretended to leave, and the newlyweds were meant to ensure the marriage was officially completed. And it wasn't romantic. Not really. Imagine having to begin your marriage with an audience just outside the door, whispering about whether the bride looked properly nervous or strangely calm. Some families even documented it, which is perhaps the worst genre of medieval paperwork ever created. Picture, for example, a young noblewoman in France, maybe 14 years old, sitting in her wedding chamber while her grandmother and 3 aunts fuss over her hair and repeatedly remind her that this is the duty God commanded. And she's thinking something along the lines of, God seems unusually interested in my personal evening. Those women offering advice? Most of them had their own traumatic memories of wedding nights. Memories they spoke of only in whispers, like soldiers discussing battlefields. Let's float over to England, around the time of Henry II. His daughter Matilda of England was married at the age of 8 to the Duke of Saxony. 8! Let that settle softly into your mind. Now, to be clear, the marriage wasn't consummated until she was older, but the knowledge that she would one day be expected to perform adult duties hung over her entire adolescence like a cloud that never dissipated. And this is something modern audiences often forget. Dread doesn't begin on the wedding night. It begins when you first learn what will be expected of you. Some girls were taught almost nothing. Others were told vague metaphors that probably did more damage than silence would have. Some were given instructional prayers instead of actual information. All of this created an atmosphere of confusion and quiet fear. Even queens felt it. Let's drift gently toward Isabella of Valois, married to the much older Richard II of England. She was just a child, 9 years old. Again, the marriage wasn't consummated. But imagine the emotional burden. She suddenly had a husband she could not understand, in a country whose language she barely spoke, surrounded by courtiers who watched her every step. And she knew, because everyone made sure she knew, that eventually this man would expect her to become a real wife. And if she did not, if she refused or was frightened or was unwell, then she would be blamed. After all, women were always blamed. Let's float further into the private side of things, where the real dread lived. For many medieval women, the wedding night symbolized the beginning of a permanent physical vulnerability. Childbirth was dangerous. Pain management was non-existent. Medical knowledge was a cocktail of herbs, prayers, lucky charms, and confident guesses. A bride knew that whatever happened that night could lead to pregnancies, dozens of them if she survived. She also knew she had almost no control over her body from that moment onward. Imagine lying there in a stone chamber, candles guttering against a cold draft, while your new husband, possibly someone you've spoken to only a handful of times, approaches the bed. His emotions range anywhere from shy to impatient to drunk. This was normal. Many medieval grooms cope with nervousness by drinking heavily at the wedding feast. It was considered socially acceptable. Thoughtful? Not really, but acceptable. For noblemen, especially, their wedding night was framed as a duty to their lineage. Produce heirs, preferably quickly, preferably many, preferably boys. A groom who failed to do so often faced ridicule, and a bride who failed, she faced worse. Suspicion, whispered gossip, accusations of curses, accusations of witchcraft, accusations of being barren, which medieval people believed was usually the woman's fault. So yes, of course women were scared. And then there was the matter of age difference. Medieval marriages often paired teenage girls with men in their late 20s, early 30s, or older. Think of Blanche of Lancaster, married young into a world of older men discussing politics she barely understood. Or Margaret Beaufort, who became a mother at 12 to Henry Tudor, no less. She endured a birth so traumatic it permanently damaged her body. Her wedding night was the beginning of that chain of events. Drift for a moment on that thought. A child giving birth to a child. That's the tragedy behind the polite phrases medieval chroniclers used, like, she was married young, or she fulfilled her duty. Those duties were not gentle. Let's soften the focus now, just a little, because not all medieval wedding nights were terrifying. Some were awkwardly sweet. Some couples grew to like each other. Some discovered genuine companionship, even love. But even in those cases, the first night was still heavy with pressure. Take Eleanor of Aquitaine and Louis VII. Their personalities could not have been more different if one of them had been a torch and the other a bucket of water. Eleanor was bold, fiery, and politically smart. Louis was pious, shy, and easily overwhelmed by everything, including Eleanor. Chroniclers record that Louis prayed extensively before the wedding night, which Eleanor probably found either endearing or concerning. Their early marriage was uncomfortable, filled with mismatched expectations, but at least it was free of the public spectacle some couples endured. Other brides, especially in villages, did not have elaborate ceremonies or chambers. Their wedding nights took place in simple cottages with straw mattresses, wooden shutters, and maybe a single candle. But even there, the traditions could be overwhelming. In some regions, friends waited outside the door. In others, they sang for hours. In some places, they knocked to encourage the couple to hurry. In others, they demanded proof the next morning. These practices varied wildly, but the result was the same. The wedding night was never private. Imagine lying awake, 100 eyes outside the door, all expecting a very specific outcome that they would soon gossip about. It's no wonder medieval women dreaded it. Let's drift toward some actual anecdotes, because history is filled with them. There's a story of Joan of Kent, whose love life was so complicated it resembled a medieval soap opera. Married secretly to one man, married publicly to another, and then forced into years of legal chaos to unwind the entire situation. Her wedding nights were less about dread and more about confusion. No one, not even Joan, seemed certain which wedding night was the official one. There's a story of Catherine de Valois, whose first husband Henry V died soon after their marriage, leaving her a teenage widow. She dreaded her wedding night not because she feared Henry, but because she feared court politics. Every step she took was watched by advisors who worried she might remarry too quickly and threatened to control over the young heir. Her private life became an international negotiation. There's a tragic tale of Isabella of Castile's future daughter, Catherine of Aragon, whose first wedding night with Arthur Tudor was so politically crucial that people still argue about whether it even happened. Catherine insisted it did not. English ambassadors insisted it did. The truth remains lost in the haze of Tudor politics, but the pressure on Catherine was immense. Her words determined the legality of her second marriage, one that would eventually break England from a Catholic church. Every story, whether noble or common, shares the same threads: pressure, expectation, fear of failure, and the knowledge that the wedding night was more important to society than to the couple themselves. Let's drift now toward the emotional reality, the one historians sometimes forget to emphasize. For many women, the wedding night represented the end of girlhood. That soft, fleeting time of dolls, ribbons, and running barefoot through fields turned into adulthood overnight. And adulthood came swiftly without mercy. The weight of a kingdom's future or a village's expectations or a family's finances all rested on her shoulders before she even learned how to navigate her own emotions. Imagine the loneliness of that moment, the hush of the chamber, the flickering candlelight, the knowledge that tomorrow she would wake as someone new, not because she felt changed, but because society declared she must be. And so the dread was not fear of the husband himself, although sometimes that was part of it. It was fear of a role she hadn't chosen, a future she couldn't predict, and a body she didn't entirely understand. Let me ask you gently, if you lived in that world, which part do you think would have frightened you the most? The lack of privacy? The pressure to perform? The total absence of information? Or simply the feeling of being thrust onto a stage you never auditioned for? Tell me softly in the comments if you're still awake. If you remember where we left off, and don't worry if you don't, your brain is probably halfway asleep by now. We had just stepped through the threshold of the medieval bridal chamber, a place that was supposed to symbolize purity, fertility, and the solemn unity of two souls, but more often symbolized exhaustion, confusion, and a profound desire for everyone else to leave the room. Because, as we discussed in part 1, medieval wedding nights were rarely private. And I wish I could tell you that we're now entering a calmer, quieter part of the night. But no such mercy. Now we enter the ritualized chaos of the bedding ceremony and all the wonderfully uncomfortable facts surrounding it. So let's continue our little sleepy stroll through the medieval night, where the candles burn low, the wine is strong, and the social expectations are even stronger. Aye! The bedding ceremony, a whole event no one asked for. We tend to imagine wedding nights as intimate, soft, candlelit, something cinematic. Medieval people did not. Medieval society looked at the quiet, intimate concept of privacy and said, "No, thank you. We prefer witnesses." As soon as the feast ended, and sometimes not even then, a procession formed. A loud one, a merry one, occasionally an intoxicated one. And this procession escorted the couple through the hall toward their bedchamber. Think of it like a parade, except instead of floats or confetti, you had friends, family, priests, local nobles, occasionally musicians, and the bridal party, all aggressively walking the couple to their bedroom. And because medieval entertainment options were limited, this was considered a high point of the evening. The noisy mass of people would accompany the bride and groom to the bed, singing bawdy songs or shouting helpful marital advice. Because nothing says romance like your uncle yelling instructions over the sound of a lute. The couple would then be ceremonially undressed. Not by each other, by the wedding party. Let that sink in. If you are imagining soft candlelight and gentle whispering, stop that. This was closer to a theatrical performance with layers of symbolism, tradition, and community involvement. Because the bedding ceremony was not simply about consummation. It was a public declaration that the marriage was real, that the couple were now one household, and that the bride belonged to her husband's kin. So of course they all needed to be there. Because medieval logic. 2. Why the bedding ceremony existed at all. The ceremony seems outrageous to us now, but it made perfect sense to medieval people. For a few reasons. 1. Validity of the marriage. In many periods of medieval history, as long as two adults exchanged vows and consummated the marriage, it existed. Consummation sealed the deal. No consummation, the marriage could be annulled. So, naturally, people wanted proof. And nothing says proof like 30 relatives standing around the bed with candles. 2. The transfer of guardianship. To medieval families, marriage was less about love and more about moving a woman from the legal control of her father to that of her husband. The ceremony symbolized this shift. The bride was taken from her family's hands in a literal parade and physically delivered to her new life. 3. Fertility anxiety. Medieval societies cared an enormous amount about fertility, not simply because children were cute or fun or fulfilling, though I'm sure some parents found that to be a nice bonus, but because heirs were essential. Inheritance, land, alliances, everything depended on children. Thus, everyone wanted to be absolutely certain that the couple at least attempted to produce one. 4. Communal life. Privacy was a luxury medieval people rarely had. People slept in the same room, ate in the same room, lived in the same space. The idea of two newlyweds disappearing behind a closed door? Absolutely foreign. This was not the era of do not disturb signs. 3. Bedding customs across medieval Europe. Now, just because these ceremonies existed across Europe doesn't mean they were identical. Each region had its own flavor, which we will now explore slowly, calmly, as if we're leafing through an illuminated manuscript at half speed. England and France, loud, rowdy, and full of songs. In many English and French households, the bedding ceremony involved rowdy singing, playful teasing, drinking, and, occasionally, throwing the couple onto the bed, gently one hopes. The attendants pulled off the bride's shoes, a symbolic act signifying the husband's authority, and removed pins from her hair. This wasn't just symbolic. Removing all her hairpins took time and offered the perfect opportunity for gossip. Germany, toasts, prayers, and ritual humor. German households often prayed over the couple before leaving the room. But they also had a long-standing love of practical jokes. For example, some families placed children under the bed, hid bells in the blankets, or arranged for loud noises to erupt at a critical moment. All of this was considered extremely humorous. To someone, Scandinavia, weapons and symbolic strength. In some Scandinavian regions, the groom placed weapons, like a sword, between him and his bride until they were officially alone. This was meant to symbolize protection and lineage, and possibly also a subtle way of saying, please, everyone go away now. Italy, a more private approach usually. Italian city-states, especially the wealthier ones, sometimes preferred a greater degree of privacy. Families still escorted the bride to the chamber, but often they left the room before undressing began. Not always, but often. The rich always get the better version of everything. For the bed itself, a stage for symbolism. Let's slow down even further now, because this is a Sleepless historian after all, and examine the bed, the literal centerpiece of the night. The bed was a symbol of fertility, a political stage, a demonstration of wealth, and, unfortunately, a place far too small for the number of people crowded around it during the ceremony. Feather mattresses? Only for the rich. Most newlyweds slept on straw pallets, wool blankets, wooden frames. Or, in poorer households, simply a shared family bed. The wealthy sometimes displayed enormous bridal beds, heavily carved, draped in fabric, embroidered with gold. But keep in mind this was also a public showcase of family status. The bed wasn't just a place for sleeping. It was a billboard that said, "We have money. The nightwear of the newlyweds." Let's talk about clothing. Because if there's anything disappointingly accurate about medieval wedding nights, it's that the couple was usually overdressed. Many newlyweds did not sleep naked. They wore chemises, linen under tunics, night shirts, or sometimes full-sleeve garments. This was a romantic choice. It was practicality and modesty, especially when half the household was in the room. So if you were imagining silk lingerie, erase that mental image. Replace it with linen. So much linen. Soft, scratchy, inescapable linen. Medieval Europe really said, "We fear sin, but we do not fear chafing." 6. What about the bride? Emotions, expectations, and reality. We talk a lot about customs, but very little about the people inside them. So let's slow the pace, dim the lanterns a bit more, and try to understand what a medieval bride might have felt. Fear. Many brides were very young. 14, 15, 16, not unusual. Their wedding night was not a private choice or romantic decision. It was a duty, a social obligation, a requirement, exhaustion. Weddings lasted all day. Feasting could continue past midnight. Brides were often overwhelmed, physically and socially. The idea that this was a magical night is a modern fiction. Uncertainty. Knowledge about sex was inconsistent. Some girls knew very little. Some knew a lot. Most learned from older women, gossip, church warnings, scandalous stories whispered at marketplaces, pressure. Their entire family's expectations rested on their shoulders. The pressure conceived early was immense. Hope. We shouldn't dismiss the possibility that many brides were genuinely hopeful. Some loved their husbands. Some were relieved to escape strict family homes. Some looked forward to building a household. History is filled with nuance, even in the awkward moments. 7. What about the groom? Expectations and anxieties. The groom, meanwhile, was expected to perform flawlessly. No pressure. He was supposed to demonstrate virility, exhibit confidence, impress his peers, and reassure both families that heirs would arrive promptly. But grooms also experienced performance anxiety. This is not a modern invention. It existed in the Middle Ages. It probably existed in ancient Mesopotamia. It probably existed the first time humans invented social expectations. Fear of failure. Inability to consummate could mean annulment. And annulment meant political humiliation. Exhaustion. He, too, had been feasting since dawn. Social pressure. Everyone expected him to be calm, confident, and capable, a medieval Superman wearing a tunic. In reality, he was often just as nervous as the bride. 8. What happened after the witnesses left? Once the procession filed out, finally, closed the door and left the couple alone, the atmosphere changed dramatically. Silence settled in. Candles burned low. The chamber smelled faintly of incense, sweat, and crushed herbs scattered earlier for luck. And for the first time that night, the newlyweds were simply two people in a room. Sometimes they consummated immediately. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they fell asleep right there, fully clothed, because nothing is more historically grounded than sheer exhaustion. Consummation was expected, but not always immediate. Some records mention couples waiting, until the candles burned out, until the room warmed, until the next morning, or several days later. Life is rarely as tidy as laws or ritual demand. 9. The morning after, evidence, expectations, and reality. Now, brace yourself, because the medieval morning after ritual was dramatic in many places, especially medieval France, Italy, and part of England. Families expected evidence, literal evidence, a bloodstained sheet. This expectation rested on several incorrect assumptions: that all brides were virgins, that all virgins bled, that bleeding was proof of honor, that a sheet could never lie. Spoiler: it could. If the sheet remained unstained, panic ensued. Not always. That depends on the region. But often enough that historical records mention it frequently. Some families, desperate to avoid shame, quietly sprinkle blood from chickens, sheep, or other sources onto the sheet before showing it to guests. History is not an era of perfection. It's an era of creative problem solving. X. Church involvement, blessings, boundaries, and contradictions. We should take a moment to discuss the church. The medieval church had many opinions about marriage and sex, most of them contradictory, and all of them delivered with absolute confidence. Church leaders insisted sex inside marriage was holy. Sex outside marriage was evil. Excessive enjoyment of sex, even inside marriage, was sinful. But avoiding sex entirely was also sinful because God required fertility. And yet sex purely for pleasure was banned. But sex exclusively for reproduction was encouraged. But then certain days of the week were forbidden for intercourse, and certain seasons of the year, and most feast days, and definitely Lent. Medieval couples often needed a calendar just to avoid committing a religious misdemeanor. 11. Moves from public to private over time. One of the most interesting trends. If you're the type of person who finds slow socio-cultural evolution interesting, which, if you're here, you clearly are, is that bedding ceremonies gradually became more private by the late medieval period, especially in richer households. The ceremony became more symbolic and less intrusive. People realized that maybe couples did not need a cheering audience. Privacy became fashionable, then expected, then normal. Humanity slowly, painfully discovered boundaries. 12. The quiet truth beneath the rituals. After stripping away the noise, the rituals, the witnesses, the decorations, the expectations, and the occasionally roasted goose thrown into the ceremony for no clear reason, we arrive at something soft and almost tender. A medieval wedding night was simply two human beings facing the unknown. The emotions beneath the ritual chaos were familiar. Nervousness, excitement, fear, curiosity, hope, awkwardness, and a desire to get through it safely. Strip away the medieval clothing, the bedding parades, the church rules, and the political alliances, and what remains is profoundly human. Two people becoming a household. 13. And so we end part 2. The candles are burning low now. The feast is over. The witnesses have left the room. The bed is warm. The night is quiet again. We have wandered slowly, gently, through bedding rituals, cultural variations, bridal and groom emotions, clothing and expectations, morning after customs, church rules, and the gradual evolution of privacy. Part 2 has carried us deeper into the medieval night, and Part 3 will continue with superstitions about fertility, strange remedies for ensuring male heirs, forbidden practices, medieval medical beliefs, and the dozens of myths surrounding honeymoon rituals. But for now, rest. We will pick up the story again soon. Let's slip back into the quiet of the medieval chamber. Soft candle flicker, heavy oak door closed, the world outside fading into the hush of nighttime. We left our newlyweds at the end of Part 2 alone in their room for the first time. The wedding guests finally dispersed like a noisy flock of birds. Now, the great and terrible truth of medieval marriage looms. Everything rides on fertility. If the bedding ceremony was theatrical performance, then the morning after, and every night that followed, became part of a long, anxious waiting game. So tonight, in Part 3, we wander deeper into the labyrinth of medieval beliefs about fertility, superstitions, strange medical science, early honeymoon customs, nights when things didn't quite work, and how families reacted when heirs failed to appear. Once again, no rush. Let the torches flicker. Settle your mind into the slow rhythm of medieval time. Here we go. The medieval obsession with fertility. In medieval Europe, nearly every aspect of life revolved around inheritance, land, titles, wealth, property, even a family's survival during famine. So the entire medieval world, families, neighbors, priests, midwives, fortune tellers, watched newly married couples with intense interest. This wasn't romance. It was economics. And so the pressure on couples began immediately, sometimes literally the next morning. Because nothing says good morning like your mother-in-law knocking at the door cheerfully asking, well, any progress toward grandchildren? Medieval newlyweds did not have the luxury of privacy, emotional processing, or slow romantic development. What they had was expectation, duty, and a cultural belief that fertility was a measurable moral virtue. If a couple conceived quickly, people said the marriage was blessed. If not, well, that's where the superstitions began to bloom. 2. Medieval beliefs about fertility. Prepare yourself. Let's explore the theories medieval people had about conception and fertility. I must warn you, these theories were backed by absolute confidence and absolutely no science. 1. Heat and cold. Doctors under the influence of classical Greco-Arabic medicine believed that fertility depended on proper bodily temperaments. A man needed to be warm and dry, like a well-baked loaf of bread, and a woman needed to be warm and moist, like something less appetizing. If a woman was too cold, conception was hard. If a man was too cold, conception was impossible. So couples attempted to preheat themselves before bed with warm wine, spices, heated bricks wrapped in cloth, baths with herbs, blankets warmed by the fire. Essentially, medieval people accidentally invented the electric blanket centuries before the electric part. 2. The right position. Medical authorities of the time wrote extensively about the correct position for conception. I'm not going to describe explicit acts, but I can safely say that medieval texts were very confident in their instructions. These ideas varied region to region, but in general, one position was believed to encourage sons, another for daughters, another for strong children, another for avoiding infertility, another for spiritual purity, and at least 3 that were explicitly banned by the church, who had surprisingly detailed opinions on the matter. The consistency in all these theories? 0. Absolutely 0. But the confidence? Utterly unshakable. 3. Astrology. Astrologers advise couples to conceive under certain moon phases, when specific stars aligned, on days ruled by Venus, but definitely not under Saturn, who was considered a grumpy celestial presence. Planning conception based on star charts was surprisingly common. A medieval astrologer once wrote, for a son, join under the waxing moon. For a daughter, the waning, which has no scientific basis but tremendous poetic charm. 4. Amulets and charms. People wore amber beads, dried roses, iron rings, wolf teeth, carved stones, knotted ribbons. Some women tucked fertility charms into their clothing, while others tied them directly to the bedposts. When in doubt, medieval people loved accessories. 5. Diet matters, supposedly. Certain foods were believed to boost fertility. Almonds, honey wine, eggs, pomegranates, leeks, figs, warm milk, and most importantly, mead, which leads us slowly, peacefully, to another part of this history. 3. The origin of the honeymoon. You might have heard the claim that the honeymoon began as a period where newlyweds drank honey wine mead for a month to encourage fertility. And yes, this contains a kernel of truth wrapped in a thick layer of legend. Let's untangle it. The mead month. In some early Northern European cultures, especially Germanic ones, mead was considered a fertility drink. Honey symbolized sweetness, abundance, and vitality. The belief was that drinking mead after marriage encouraged strong children, male heirs, a harmonious household, and general good fortune. The honeymoon was literally the honey month, a period of drinking mead after the wedding. But not every region practiced this. And by the high medieval era, the honeymoon had transformed into something different. The medieval honeymoon, as we think of it, we tend to imagine a couple leaving their medieval ceremony and heading off to a quiet cottage by the sea. No, absolutely no. A medieval honeymoon was not a private trip. It was the exact opposite. What usually happened was the bride and groom traveled to visit all the husband's relatives. Each household offered gifts. Each home held a feast, and the entire trip took several weeks or months. This was less a romantic getaway and more political tour, a meet and greet with expectations. And, unsurprisingly, fertility remained a theme. Relatives offered gifts like herbs for conception, spices, blankets, silver coins, and occasionally unsolicited advice. Medieval people loved giving advice, for when consummation didn't happen immediately, despite the public rituals and enormous pressure, not every marriage was consummated on the first night, for many reasons. One, exhaustion. Realistically, a wedding was an all-day event with non-stop noise, and no privacy, and heavy food, and gallons of wine, followed by a crowd escorting you to bed. It's a miracle anyone stayed conscious. Many couples simply collapsed into bed, fully clothed, and slept like fallen soldiers. 2. Fear anxiety. We often imagine medieval marriages as simple duty, but emotions were very real. Brides could be terrified, overwhelmed, unprepared. Grooms could be nervous, overconfident, underconfident, or utterly bewildered. Both could freeze. Both could hesitate. Both were human. 3. Age. Sometimes the bride or groom, usually the bride, was too young. Physical maturity mattered. In such cases, families agreed to delay consummation. 4. Illness or injury. Wedding feasts were filled with spoiled meat, questionable wine, and the medieval belief that hand-washing was optional. Food poisoning was not rare. Some couples spent their wedding night within sprinting distance of a wooden bucket. 5. Religious prohibitions. Certain days of the week and seasons were forbidden for intercourse. Imagine getting married on a Friday, only to be told the wedding night must wait until Sunday. No excitement, just scheduling conflicts. V. The church's complicated relationship with wedding nights. We dipped into this in part 2, but now we'll slow down and examine it more clearly. The church believed sex inside marriage was holy. Sex without desire was ideal. Sex with desire was slightly dangerous. Sex on feast days was prohibited. Sex on Sundays? Also questionable. Sex during Lent? Absolutely not. Sex during Advent? No. Sex during pregnancy? Discouraged. Sex for pleasure? Frowned upon. Sex solely for reproduction? Strongly recommended. So the church wanted newlyweds to produce children, but not to enjoy producing children, but also not to do it too often, but also not to avoid it, but also only at certain times. Imagine trying to follow all of this on the biggest night of your life. It's a miracle medieval people had children at all. 6. Superstitions for conceiving a male heir. Now we reach one of the most important and absurdly creative parts of medieval wedding night culture. The obsessive desire for a son. To medieval families, daughters were blessings, but sons were essential for inheriting land, continuing family names, securing political alliances, maintaining property rights. So families developed a wide array of superstitions to guarantee a male heir. Some believed, 1. Eat certain foods. To conceive a boy, a bride should eat roasted apples, leeks, pigeon hearts, boiled onions, and bread soaked in wine. To conceive a girl, she should eat dairy, fish, lettuce, and soft cheeses, which again has no scientific basis except perhaps indigestion. 2. Avoid certain phases of the moon. Conception under a waxing moon meant sons. Under full moon meant daughters. Under a waning moon meant misfortune. Again, no evidence, much confidence. 3. Magical stones. Certain gemstones, jasper, red coral, carnelian, were believed to influence gender. One medieval writer confidently claimed that a stone warmed in the hand will produce a male child, which tells us more about medieval optimism than medicine. 4. Placement of the bed. A bed facing north meant sons. Facing south meant daughters. Facing west? Bad idea. Families rearranged furniture accordingly. 7. When fertility failed. Now we reach the quiet, heavy part of the story. Not dramatic, not comedic, just real. When the months passed and no pregnancy appeared, anxiety deepened. Whispers started. Advice flooded in. Doctors and priests were consulted. Midwives offered herbs and tinctures. Astrologers checked charts. Neighbors speculated. Families panicked. Sometimes both husband and wife were blamed. Sometimes only the woman. Medieval explanations for infertility included cold humors, demonic influence, insufficient prayer, blocked seed, weak womb, excessive melancholy, magical interference, overheating of the body, underheating of the body, sleeping on the wrong side of the bed, witnessing a lunar eclipse, not wearing enough amulets. Again, science was not invited to this party. 8. Remedies, potions, and medieval medical wisdom, such as it was. Midwives and herbalists recommended treatments that range from sensible to please do not attempt this at home. Sensible remedies, warm baths, honey mixtures, herbal teas, massage, nutrient-rich foods. These at least have some logic. Less sensible remedies, wearing rabbit fur against the skin, holding a magnet over the womb, sleeping with a fresh onion under the pillow, drinking potions made from crushed insects, applying warm animal fat to the stomach, stepping over a grave at midnight, and because medieval people had strong stomachs. Truly terrible remedies. I will skip explicit biological details, but let's just say some potions contained ground animal parts, blood, powdered bone, liquids not meant for drinking, all taken with absolute sincerity. 9. The emotional landscape of the medieval marriage bed. As months passed, the medieval marital bed became more than a place to sleep. It became a site of hope, a site of disappointment, a place of pressure, a place of intimacy, a battlefield of expectations, a quiet corner of everyday life. Some couples grew closer under the pressure. Some grew distant. Some formed deep emotional partnerships. Some remained strangers sharing a household. We often romanticize medieval weddings as grand spectacles, but the truth is quieter and more poignant. Two people trying to build a family under immense pressure, with limited knowledge and too many opinions from everyone around them. The tenderness was real. The fear was real. The humanity was real. X, as we end part 3, the candles have burned low again. The night deepens. The household sleeps. And the newlyweds lie awake, wondering what the future holds. Part 3 has carried us through fertility fears, medieval medical beliefs, honeymoon origins, strange remedies, gender superstitions, the emotional reality of marriages under pressure. If you made it this far in our gentle midnight wandering through medieval matrimony, then, first of all, thank you. Secondly, congratulations. We've now arrived at the part of the story that Hollywood often rushes into with candles and harp music. But as always, real medieval life looked at Hollywood, squinted very hard, and said, absolutely not. Because where we left off, our medieval couple having just survived the wedding feast, the blessings, the veils, the procession, and the blinding gauntlet of social expectations, they now approach a threshold far stranger and far more culturally complicated than the modern viewer might imagine. So settle in, blanket around your shoulders. No rush. Let's walk gently into the dimly lit chambers of medieval Europe, where the wedding night was less about passion and more about proof, politics, prayer, superstition, and an entire audience of people who truly should not have been there. Yes, we're finally here. The wedding night begins, with more people than you'd like. A thing you should know about medieval life is that the concept of privacy was often treated like a dangerous myth, best avoided. Most homes had few rooms. Servants slept on floors. Children shared beds. And curtains were considered luxurious. That included the wedding night. Not always, of course. It depended on the century, the region, and the family status. But in many households, especially noble ones, the newly married couple didn't simply slip away quietly. No, they were escorted. Imagine this. You've just endured hours of ritual, ceremony, and feasting. Your cheeks ache from smiling. Your stomach is full of bread, roasted meat, and the medieval equivalent of spiced wine that could strip paint. You want rest. And a crowd of cheerful, nosy relatives says, wonderful, time to go to the bridal chamber. We're all coming with you. The couple will be led to the manor or hall, candles in hand, guests singing or joking loudly, each relative fully committed to the idea that this was all necessary and normal. What today would be politely considered a very intense invasion of personal space was, back then, a sign of community, legitimacy, and, surprisingly, support. The marriage was not merely personal. It was a contract woven into the stability of the community. And that meant everyone got very invested in it. The bed itself was important, sometimes sacred. The bridal bed was considered a symbolic center of family continuity. The bed might be freshly stuffed with clean straw, sprinkled with herbs for fertility, decorated with ribbons, rosemary, or even flowers, blessed by priests, or, for wealthier couples, freshly made with imported linens. In some parts of medieval Europe, the bed was blessed with holy water. In others, mothers or aunts recited whispered prayers for fertility, prosperity, and, let's be honest, healthy heirs. Sometimes the entire bed was treated almost like a small altar. The anxieties surrounding future children were immense. A marriage without offspring was not simply a heartbreak. It was a political disaster. So the bed was more than furniture. It was a stage on which the continuation of the family line depended. No pressure. The putting to bed ceremony. This is the moment where modern audiences usually widen their eyes and say, "They did what?" But don't worry, I will keep everything comfortably PG, because this is a history lesson, not a reenactment. The bedding ceremony varied between cultures, but the general pattern went something like this. The couple entered the room together. Female companions undressed the bride to her shift. Male companions undressed the groom to his shirt. The couple was placed into the bed, blankets up to the chin. People said blessings, cracked jokes, or threw symbolic items. Bread, flowers, nuts. Everyone finally left. Yes, it was awkward. Medieval people knew it was awkward, but awkwardness was part of the tradition. It meant the community had witnessed the legitimacy of the marriage. In some regions, particularly France and Germany, there was even a humorous element. Guests shouted teasing remarks, sang songs, or made fertility jokes that would make a modern couple quietly pack their bags and elope. But to medieval people, it was all normal, expected, tradition. The most common feeling among brides and grooms? Can everyone please leave so we can sleep? A marriage that wasn't consummated wasn't a marriage. Legally speaking, the church recognized a marriage as valid after consent and consummation. If either was missing, the marriage could be challenged or annulled. This meant that, from the church's legal perspective, the wedding night had immense importance. 2 signatures on a contract? Nice. But what mattered was the act that followed. Thus, the bridal chamber was layered with pressure, social pressure, legal pressure, religious pressure, family expectation, future inheritance concerns. The couple themselves, likely exhausted, nervous, or strangers, were at the center of a legal ritual disguised as a personal moment. So if you're wondering, did medieval couples ever simply fall asleep instead? Absolutely. It happened enough that jokes, poems, and sermons referenced it. But falling asleep without consummation could prompt gossip, concern, and, if you were in an important family, political panic. For most common people, they were probably too exhausted to care. False assumptions about first nights. One of the biggest myths is that medieval wedding nights were always dramatic, ceremonial, or traumatic. But many couples already knew each other. Many were already familiar, emotionally or physically. Many had no audience. Many simply went to sleep. Some consummated the next morning or days later. Some waited until they felt ready. The bedding ceremony existed, but it wasn't universal. It wasn't mandatory everywhere. And it gradually weakened over time, especially in wealthier urban households, where privacy became more desirable. Medieval life was inconsistent, localized, and deeply practical. Not every region followed the same traditions. Superstitions inside the bridal chamber. Because no medieval occasion was complete without at least 12 superstitions, the wedding night had its own. 1. Certain herbs encouraged fertility. Rosemary, sage, thyme, and rue were common. Brides sometimes carried them under the pillow. 2. Charms were hidden in the bed. Small tokens, nuts, coins, tiny car figures were tucked beneath the straw. The idea was to bless the couple with prosperity. 3. Shoes were thrown at the bed. No one is quite sure why. It seems to combine fertility symbolism with the universal human instinct to hurl footwear during celebrations. 4. Lamps stayed lit in some regions, to ward off evil spirits or to ensure witnesses could confirm the couple was safely in bed. 5. Priests bless a chamber. Not always, but sometimes, especially in high-status marriages. Each custom reflected the medieval mixture of Christian ritual and older folk beliefs. The wedding night wasn't simply about two people. It was wrapped in centuries of symbolism. For nobility, politics were in the room too. For peasants, the wedding night was usually private-ish. A single-room house made privacy impossible, but at least there weren't 50 observers holding candles. For nobility, however, things were different. A noble marriage was a political alliance, a property agreement, a future bloodline arrangement, and the wedding night was a first step in producing heirs. So, the significance of that night was enormous. Chroniclers sometimes recorded it. Yes, in actual history books, kings had their wedding nights witnessed, or, at minimum, formally attested by courtiers. Not physically witnessed, except in very early medieval periods, but attended until the point the couple was in bed. There are documented examples of entire courts lining hallways, cheering, singing, or holding candles during the bedding. Imagine starting your marriage like that. Some royal couples weren't even left alone. Servants slept in the same room. Guards stood outside the door. Advisors hovered to ensure nothing politically disastrous occurred. Medieval royalty had no privacy, least of all on their wedding night. What about nervous brides and grooms? A quiet truth often forgotten in retellings. Many medieval couples were young, inexperienced, or anxious. Though child marriage existed in some places for political alliances, actual consummation was generally delayed until an age considered physically and socially appropriate. In many regions, girls married in their mid to late teens and boys in their late teens or 20s. But regardless of age, nervousness was normal. Letters, diaries, and even sermons refer to couples who were afraid, shy, awkward, or unsure. One medieval monk wrote, "A new husband may fear the duty ahead, especially if his bride seems timid." Not exactly romantic poetry, but honesty counts. For most, the wedding night wasn't fiery passion. It was fumbling, hesitant, human, and deeply ordinary. The modern expectation of dramatic romance simply did not exist. The next morning, the real social test. Modern people worry about the wedding night itself. Medieval people worried about the morning after. The next morning mattered because it confirmed the marriage was now fully valid. It quieted gossip. It signaled that alliances and inheritance were secure. It allowed the festivities to continue. Some communities expected the bride and groom to appear at breakfast looking well-rested, which, considering everything involved, was a bold request. In certain regions, a piece of bread dipped in wine was offered a couple as a symbolic blessing. In others, elders looked for subtle signs of emotional calm or comfort between the pair. Again, everything became a public ceremony. A private night, a public mourning. The proof tradition, a complex and often misunderstood practice. The tradition of displaying proof of consummation, often exaggerated in TV dramas, did exist in some parts of medieval Europe, particularly in high-status marriages. But it was not universal, not always required, not always involving anything graphic, sometimes entirely symbolic. Many historians believe that in numerous cases, families simply assumed consummation had happened. A cloth might be displayed as a formality, even if nothing had occurred. It was more about tradition than verification. The goal was reassurance, not forensic evidence. And in many places, this did not happen at all. Medieval customs varied like dialects, rich, diverse, inconsistent, and shaped by local belief. The gentler side of wedding nights. We often focus on the awkwardness or pressure, but medieval sources also preserve a quieter truth. Some wedding nights were tender. There are love letters, poems, and chronicles written by medieval spouses describing affection, comfort, and joy. Some couples had known each other for years. Others grew close quickly. One 14th century French bride described her wedding night as a new beginning with quiet laughter between us. Another young husband wrote, "We slept side by side and spoke softly of our hopes." These moments rarely make it into historical dramas because they lack spectacle, but they were real. Not every medieval marriage was a cold alliance. Many were partnerships, sometimes arranged, sometimes chosen, that deepened over time. The wedding night was not the end. It was the beginning. After the bedding ceremony, after the rituals, after the morning greetings and the passing of bread and wine, the real work of marriage began. Daily life, shared responsibilities, land to manage, animals to feed, fields to tend, servants to direct, families to blend. Marriage was not a single night. It was a lifelong economic and social collaboration. The wedding night was simply the hinge between two worlds. The world before, where the couple were individuals, and the world after, where they were a household. It was a moment of transition, symbolic, communal, layered with expectation, sometimes tender, sometimes stressful, but always deeply significant in medieval culture. If Part 4 took us into the dimly lit bridal chamber, complete with herbs, shoes thrown for luck, awkward blessings, and an entire crowd who really should have minded their own business, then Part 5 gently leads us out into the daylight that followed. Because contrary to the way movies tell it, the wedding night wasn't a finish line. It was barely even the halfway point. In medieval life, the days after the wedding carried their own rituals, expectations, and social responsibilities. For many newly married couples, those days were far more revealing, far more stressful, and far more defining of their future life than anything that happened under candlelight on the wedding night itself. So, let's step quietly into the morning air with our bride and groom. Their wedding feast has ended. The chamber has cooled. The gossip begins to settle. And now the real marriage starts. The morning after, a public event disguised as a private one. As we mentioned before, medieval people didn't consider marriage a purely personal affair. It was a contract, an alliance, a merging of resources, a stabilizing factor for the community. And so the morning after the wedding night was, whether anyone liked it or not, a public milestone. The expectations were simple. The couple should rise at a respectable hour. They should look presentable and preferably not exhausted. They should join the household or community for breakfast. They should appear calm, friendly, and unified. In some parts of Europe, the bride emerged with a modest veil over her hair. In others, the groom was offered a ceremonial cup of wine. And in many rural communities, older married women watched the bride closely, not with malice, but with a mixture of sympathy, curiosity, and the cultural responsibility of ensuring everything had gone properly. No one asked direct questions, of course. Even medieval bluntness had limits, but body language was quietly observed. Was the bride shy or smiling? Was the groom nervous, proud, or simply hungry? Did they sit close or apart? Human nature hasn't changed much. People will read meaning into anything. The second day's feast, yes, there was often another one. Many regions held a second, smaller feast the next day, affectionately called the chivalry in some areas, the post-wedding meal, or simply day 2. This meal was more relaxed than the wedding feast. Guests who were too drunk or exhausted the night before could redeem themselves now. It was a time for laughter, stories, dancing, gift-giving, and renewing community ties. The bride and groom were expected to sit at the high table again, not because they wanted to, but because tradition demanded visibility. Medieval life loved visible rituals almost as much as it loved bread and ale. The bride might receive household tools as gifts: a woven basket, a new spindle, kitchen utensils, linen, or, for wealthier families, decorative items or religious icons. The groom, on the other hand, might receive tools for work: a new knife, a belt, a cloak, a pair of sturdy boots, or livestock. Everything was symbolic. Gifts for building a life. Hollywood gives roses. Medieval Europe gave practical items because survival depended on them. The transition into shared life. This is where the medieval marriage truly begins to show itself, and where the myths collapse entirely. Because while modern stories portray newlyweds basking in romance, medieval couples often went straight into work. Depending on the social class, the next days looked radically different. For peasant couples, life started immediately. There was no honeymoon period. There was no trip to the seaside. There was no soft-focused pastoral montage. Instead, on day 2, the bride helped prepare meals or straighten the household space. On day 2, the groom inspected tools, checked animals, or prepared for seasonal tasks. On day 2, the in-laws quietly observed how the couple functioned together. Work waited for no one, not even newlyweds. If the marriage meant the bride moved into the groom's home, she began adapting to the rhythms of that household, learning the kitchen layout, meeting extended family, understanding her new duties, working beside older women, adapting to new expectations. If the groom moved into her home, which happened more often than people assume, especially when the bride was an heiress, he had his own adjustments, learning land responsibilities, managing tools he hadn't used before, meeting his wife's relatives, navigating a new social hierarchy. Marriage in peasant life wasn't simply emotional bonding. It was functional. 2 people merging into one working unit. For artisans and townsfolk, the shop was part of the marriage. Slightly above peasants were artisans, merchants, and skilled workers. Their marriages were still unromantic in the modern sense, but they involved a fascinating dynamic. The workshop. The new spouse, often the bride, became part of the economic engine of the household. She kept accounts, managed apprentices, helped craft goods, sold items in markets, dealt with clients. A wife was legally and economically tied to her husband's business. Marriage wasn't only a union of bodies. It was a union of labor. In many guilds, a man could not run a shop without a wife, because wives are considered essential partners in economic life. That is how intertwined marriage and work were. On the wedding night, the couple symbolically united. On the next day, they literally united in business. For nobility, politics began immediately. If you think noble couples had a slower, gentler start to their marriage, think again. For nobles, the days after the wedding were often packed with political meetings, land inspections, inheritance discussions, witness ceremonies, alliances formalization, letters to other nobles, religious obligations, travel planning. The bride, in particular, suddenly found herself navigating a complex environment. New ladies-in-waiting, new servants, new authority structure, new expectations, new political alliances, new household rules. Some noble brides immediately traveled to their husband's estate. Some moved hundreds of miles away, never again seeing the home of their childhood. Some were met with warm affection. Others entered cold halls where they were politely regarded as the person who must produce heirs. Medieval nobility did not disguise their priorities. Married life begins with learning each other's habits. Yes, even in the medieval world, marriage had the same universal problem. Living with another human being is complicated. In the first weeks, couples noticed which person woke up earliest, who snored, who preferred silence, who was chatty, whether they had similar temperaments, whether they clashed, whether one was stubborn or gentle, whether they shared humor. Medieval life was structured and ritualized, but people were still people. Some couples grew close quickly, some took months, some never did. But almost all learned that marriage was less about one dramatic wedding night and more about countless small moments afterward. The role of extended family and in-law diplomacy. Marriage did not create a home of 2 people. It created a network. The new bride or groom entered a web of relatives, with all their expectations, loyalties, rivalries, and habits. In-laws played a huge role in early medieval marriage. They advised, they supervised, they intervened, they criticized, they supported, they negotiated disputes. Some mothers-in-law acted as mentors. Some were affectionate, some were strict, some were, let's call it, challenging. It's comforting to know that the universal human experience of learning to navigate in-laws has existed for at least 1,000 years. The community's role, observation, and acceptance. After a wedding, the community evaluated how well the couple fit into their shared world. Did they work well? Were they respectful? Did they participate in festivals and church life? Were they reliable? Did they help neighbors when needed? Acceptance was not automatic. Reputation mattered. A strong marriage strengthened community. A turbulent marriage destabilized it. A childless marriage created gossip. A flourishing marriage improved alliances and trade. Medieval people viewed marriage as a communal anchor, the bride's new position balancing expectations. In almost every region of medieval Europe, marriage marked a woman's entry into full adulthood. Socially, economically, and legally, this meant enormous shifts. 1. New social status. She was now a married woman, a position with far more authority than an unmarried girl. 2. New responsibilities. Running a household was not simple. Food storage, tool maintenance, livestock management, budgeting, everything required competence. 3. New risks. Pregnancy changed everything. Childbirth was dangerous, and every community knew it. 4. New protection. Marriage granted her a defined legal identity and support system. So the days after the wedding were not about romance. They were about adjusting to a massive transformation in identity. The groom's new responsibilities. Similarly, the groom experienced his own shift. 1. Economic leadership. He was now responsible for supporting a household. 2. Social expectations. He must appear competent, reliable, hardworking. 3. Religious duties. Church attendance, charity, and moral leadership mattered. 4. Community role. He was expected to handle disputes, attend meetings, help neighbors, and protect his family. Marriage did not simply make a man a husband. It made him an adult in the eyes of society. The first week, adapting to routine. By the end of the first week, most couples had settled into a rhythm. Shared meals, shared work, shared rest times, shared visits to the church, shared understanding of each other's personalities. The wedding night faded into memory. Daily life took over. Quiet companionship or quiet distance became the new normal. Some couples grew affectionate. Some remained polite strangers. Some developed mutual respect. Some clashed bitterly in private but remained polite in public. The medieval world valued appearances. Myth versus reality. Romance was not the primary goal. A crucial truth you've probably noticed by now. Medieval marriage was practical, economic, communal, expected, traditional. Romance, where it existed, was a blessing but not a requirement. Stability mattered more than passion. That doesn't mean love didn't happen. Many medieval couples grew deeply devoted over time. Letters, poems, wills, and chronicles show genuine affection, tenderness, and grief. But love grew after marriage more often than before. The wedding night was not the climax. It was a prologue. The real story unfolded in the shared days, seasons, and years that followed. If the first 5 parts eased us through the ceremonies, the rituals, the awkward spectators, the morning after customs, and the practical realities of settling into married life, then part 6 lets us drift deeper into the emotional landscape. Quieter, softer, more reflective. Because beneath all the rituals and practicalities, medieval marriage carried an entire undertone of unspoken anxieties, especially for women. This isn't the dramatic, cinematic fear that modern retellings sometimes exaggerate. It wasn't all trembling hands and fainting candles. Medieval people were used to expectations. They grew up with them. But even so, there were worries quietly woven into nearly every bride's experience. Some fears were personal, some cultural. Some were passed down in little fragments of conversation, wrapped in superstition, wrapped in the memory of older women who had lived through their own uneasy first nights. So, let's drift into that inner world for a while. The part few chronicles mention, but everyone in their time understood. The fear of children, or rather, childbirth. Modern listeners might assume that the wedding night was fear for intimacy alone. But for medieval women, the deeper dread was what came after pregnancy. Because once a marriage was consummated, The next expectation appeared almost immediately: the production of heirs. Children were blessings, yes, but childbirth was dangerous. Every woman knew someone who had died from it. Mothers whispered warnings. Aunts offered advice in low voices. Even nuns, who had escaped marriage through religion, often saw women come into convent infirmaries suffering from the consequences of difficult births. So even teenage brides, who barely understood their own bodies, knew enough to be afraid. Imagine being a 16-year-old girl, led gently to your new household, and knowing that your wedding night marked not just a new life, but the possibility of a very final end. It's no wonder medieval women approached their wedding nights with quiet apprehension. Not panic, just a sober awareness of risk. And yet, this fear wasn't dramatized. It was simply woven into their understanding of adulthood, a kind of resigned knowledge, like knowing winter will come whether you're ready or not. The fear of a stranger, because many weddings were not love matches. While not all medieval marriages were arranged, many were, especially among the middle and upper classes. A bride might meet her groom only a few times before the wedding, or not at all. Imagine being married off to a man 10 years older, a man 20 years older, a man with a reputation you only heard whispers about, a man whose household is notoriously strict, a man whose family expects immediate obedience. Brides sometimes walked into marriage feeling like guests in someone else's home, and the wedding night, instead of being a moment of passion, was the first time they were alone with the man who would govern much of their life. Some grooms were kind, some were gentle, some were patient, but some were impatient, some were distant, some were cold, some were simply uninterested in understanding their bride's fear. And that uncertainty, that unbearable uncertainty, was enough to put a quiet knot of anxiety in most brides' stomachs. There's a recurring theme in medieval diaries and letters. Not fear men in general, but fear the unknown, because the unknown was powerful, especially in a world where so much of a woman's life depended on the temperament of the man she married. The fear of failure, because marriage was a public test. The idea of performance anxiety is not modern. It's just that in the medieval world, the stakes were far higher. A bride who did not conceive could be blamed. A bride who did not fit into the household could be criticized. A bride who did not adjust quickly enough could be judged. Even the wedding night became a public measure. Communities didn't ask directly, of course, but they watched, they noticed, and some customs, like the dreaded display of the bedsheet, turned private moments into communal commentary. You can almost feel the exhaustion of medieval women in this expectation. Marriage was not just a union. It was an evaluation. And girls grew up hearing the stories. This one was barren. That one never learned to run a home. That one angered her mother-in-law. That one failed to produce heirs. It was a malicious gossip. Not always. Sometimes it was simply cultural habit. But it created a quiet, unshakable fear. What if I don't succeed? No wonder they dreaded the wedding night. It wasn't the night itself they feared. It was the life that followed, and the scrutiny that came with it. The fear of pleasure, because it was religiously complicated. One of the strangest things about medieval marriage is that women were expected to consummate the marriage, produce children, remain modest, avoid excessive enjoyment, respect religious guidelines, and simultaneously manage not to seem cold or disinterested. Quite the balancing act. The church approved marriage. The church approved marital intimacy. But the church did not exactly encourage enjoyment. Priests reminded women to be modest. Confessors cautioned against disorderly affection. And some teachings suggested that pleasure should be a byproduct, not a pursuit. So medieval brides often approached their wedding nights with an odd tension. They were supposed to participate, but not too eagerly. They were supposed to accept intimacy, but not take pride in it. They were supposed to unite with their husband, but not seem worldly or shameless. This contradictory expectation created a quiet fear, not of the act itself, but committing moral mistakes. You can almost hear medieval brides thinking, is this allowed? How should I behave? Will God judge me if I enjoy this? Is modesty the priority, or is producing heirs? No wonder older married women tried to reassure younger ones. They understood the confusion. They lived through it. The fear of loss, because marriage could mean leaving everything behind. A bride leaving her home after marriage wasn't symbolic. It was literal. She might move to a different village, a different town, a different territory. For noble women, sometimes a different kingdom entirely. Medieval marriage often meant leaving parents, leaving siblings, leaving the familiar, leaving the childhood home, leaving the safety of known routines. Some brides cried on their wedding night, not because they feared intimacy, but because it was the first moment the enormity of the transition hit them. They were no longer daughters, no longer girls, no longer under the protection of their parents. They were now part of another household, another lineage, another future. The weight of that transformation was enormous. Even letters from noble women, one of the few written sources we have, speak of this ache. I miss my sisters. I miss my mother. I am lonely in this new place. My husband is kind, but I feel like a stranger here. Imagine being 15 or 16 or 18 and realizing that your old life has vanished, that everything ahead of you is unfamiliar, that your identity is shifting because marriage demands it. Of course, medieval women dreaded the wedding night. It marked the final moment before their world changed forever. The fear of pain, because no one explained anything properly. We often assume people in the past were naive. They weren't. But information, especially about marriage and intimacy, wasn't shared openly. Brides knew enough to fear discomfort. They heard stories. They listened to whispers. They saw the nervous smiles of older women trying to avoid frightening them too much. Some cultures tried to soften the fear with rituals, giving herbs for calmness, offering warm drinks, offering advice and metaphors, or occasionally outright explaining things. But in many regions, directness was considered improper. So brides entered the wedding night with only fragments of knowledge. Imagine the uncertainty, the guessing, the anxious anticipation. That quiet dread didn't come from drama. It came from lack of clarity. The fear of reputation, because women were judged harshly. A bride's reputation followed her into marriage. If she was known to be quiet, loud, curious, shy, stubborn, clever, or independent, people watched to see if these traits would improve or worsen with marriage. And unfortunately, medieval Europe often held women to higher standards than men. A groom could be clumsy, awkward, inexperienced, and no one cared. A bride, however, had to balance modesty with warmth, balance obedience with competence, balance innocence with marital responsibility, balance family expectations with her husband's household. The wedding night was simply the most symbolic moment of that balancing act. It was the crossing point between girlhood and womanhood. So, of course, they dreaded it. Not in fear of the act alone, but the entire system it represented. What women wished for, quietly, privately. Despite the worries, medieval women hoped for simple things. A kind husband, a gentle transition, a peaceful household, a fair mother-in-law, healthy children, mutual respect, companionship, and the chance in time to find comfort or even affection. Chronicles show tender marriages. Letters reveal genuine fondness. Some couples laughed together, worked side by side, and lived harmoniously. But in the beginning, hope and fear existed together, softly, quietly, shaping the atmosphere of the wedding night and the days that followed. And so, as we drift out of this quieter emotional space, tell me gently in the comments, which fear do you think would weigh heaviest on a medieval bride's mind? Let's drift back gently, sinking once again into those dim medieval corridors where people whispered far more about wedding beds and politics, because somehow that felt less dangerous. We've been exploring the strange weight medieval women carried into marriage, especially royal women, who were expected to create heirs almost on schedule. The expectation lingered over every banquet, every ceremony, every polished silver cup they lifted. The idea of duty wasn't noble. It hung in the air like the smoke of too many rushed torches, heavy and slightly acrid. Women learned early that their bodies were part of the architecture of dynasties, And the wedding night was the moment the Masons picked up their tools. By the time we reached the early 14th century, something had shifted. Court culture had matured into a slow-moving parade of etiquette manuals, and the newlywed couple was often surrounded by advisors armed with opinions. Everyone had an opinion. The clergy had opinions. The physicians who still thought the liver controlled emotions had opinions. And even the poets who wrote uncomfortably flowery metaphors about love had opinions. And every opinion, somehow, found its way back to the bride, whether she wanted to hear it or not. Imagine the evening of a royal wedding in the year 1325. The halls of the palace in Paris are swollen with heat, even in winter, because someone insisted on lighting every hearth to symbolize abundance. The tapestries shimmer with a kind of gold thread that never quite lies flat, creating the impression that everything is gently breathing. The bride, let's say she's 16 because that was considered sensible, is sitting next to her new husband, who is 17 and has spent most of the evening being slapped on the back by uncles who have drunk too much burgundy. She is exhausted, though she sits politely, hands folded, veil arranged just so. No one seems to care that her stomach is twisting in slow, uneasy spirals. She's thinking about the next part of the evening. Everyone is thinking about the next part of the evening, which is in itself a bit intrusive. The problem was simple. Medieval society had crafted such a ritual around consummation that it became a spectacle. Some families still held on to the old custom of preparing the bridal bed as if they were preparing an altar. There would be spices scattered under the mattress, because someone believed it helped fertility. Ribbons hung from the bedpost to symbolize poetic things no one fully understood, and linens embroidered with symbols of abundance, which were usually far less subtle than the embroiderers hoped. And the bride, poor thing, was expected to glide into the symbolic chamber like a serene dove, while her pulse hammered against her ribs. In the softer corners of Europe, such as certain Italian courts, the pressure grew into a kind of theater. They didn't always parade the couple to the bed, but they did expect them to retire, with witnesses standing not far behind. A dignified distance. They called it a distance where one could hear footsteps. A distance where one could, theoretically, confirm the couple's willingness. A distance that should not exist during anyone's private night. But medieval aristocrats never saw a boundary. They didn't want to lean over. And for the bride, the dread often began months earlier. Mothers whispered warnings. Sisters shared half-truths. Ladies-in-waiting offered comfort in soft voices, though even they were guessing. And the clergy, well, the clergy rarely helped. Some priests insisted that a wedding night was simply a duty to be fulfilled with gravity, which is possibly the least reassuring phrase ever delivered to a young woman. Others claimed that procreation was holy, but the act itself was best endured in silence. Very uplifting guidance. But as we continue drifting forward, one detail becomes clear. Many royal brides approach their wedding night with a sense of resigned inevitability rather than romantic anticipation. For them, this wasn't the beginning of a love story. It was the beginning of a contract. And if the groom happened to be someone like Charles the Bald, who, despite the flattering nickname, had the emotional range of a stale loaf, it didn't help. Or if he resembled the more unfortunate monarchs who had the physical grace of startled goats, that added its own complications. One bride famously fainted at the sight of her new husband removing his wedding cloak, not because he was frightening, but because she realized, in that moment, the finality of her situation. Let's drift now toward one of the stranger traditions that plagued medieval noblewomen, the dreaded virginal inspection. Not every region indulged in this ritual, but enough did that it deserves its own quiet corner of discussion. Sometimes the groom's family wanted proof that the bride was untouched, as the legal records phrase it with alarming confidence. A midwife or a court-appointed matron might be summoned to confirm it, often with the bride standing cold and embarrassed in a room full of stone walls and too many candles. This practice was deeply humiliating and not remotely reliable, but people relied on it anyway, because superstition held more power than tenderness. And then, because medieval Europe thrived on making things worse, the blood-stained sheet on the wedding night became a kind of trophy in some courts. It could be displayed, whispered about, or delivered discreetly to the bride's mother as confirmation. If the sheet remained unstained, however, then the questioning began. Physicians were called. Priests were summoned. and the poor bride became the center of a storm she could never have prepared for. Few things were more dreaded than a wedding night with spectators waiting in the hall for evidence of success. If you're listening to this while drifting towards sleep, you might be thinking that medieval Europe simply didn't know how to leave people alone. And you'd be right. Royal privacy existed mostly in poetry, where couples wandered through orchards hand in hand, blissfully free of political obligation. Reality was closer to a heavily supervised tax audit. But not every wedding night was catastrophe. Some couples genuinely liked each other. A few even loved each other, though romance in royal marriages was considered a charming accident rather than a goal. Love stories happened. Quietly, like small fires glowing in hidden corners. We rarely hear about them precisely because they cause so little drama. Chroniclers preferred scandal. Calm, happy marriages didn't sell manuscripts. Still, there were moments of tenderness recorded in diaries and letters. One French princess described her wedding night as not unkind, which may be the medieval equivalent of a 5-star review. A German noblewoman wrote that her husband asked if she was frightened and paused every few moments to offer reassurance. These tiny moments of humanity glow softly between the heavier stories, like lanterns suspended in dark rafters. Yet despite the rare kindnesses, the shadow hanging over most brides remained the same, produce an air. And quickly, for many medieval women, especially queens, their entire worth was tied to fertility. The wedding night was simply the opening act. Take, for example, Maria of Aragon, who entered her marriage already aware that she was expected to deliver a son before the year was over. The pressure carved itself into her daily life. She prayed more often, fasted more frequently, and wrote letters filled with self-doubt. She felt the failure of her womb, like a political defeat, and all this weight rested on her shoulders because of one tense, uncomfortable night after a wedding feast. As we drift on, let's move toward the medical theory surrounding fertility, because few things reveal medieval strangeness quite like their understanding of biology. Physicians believe that a woman conceived more easily after eating warm foods, wearing red linens, avoiding cold air, and maintaining a calm mind, which was ironic, considering nothing about the wedding night rituals encourage calmness. They also believe that a woman must experience delight to conceive, though they didn't particularly care whether she actually did. The logic was circular and profoundly inconvenient. And if conception didn't occur soon, the blame almost always fell upon the woman. Forget that the groom might be 15 and more interested in falconry than marital responsibilities. Forget that some kings had anatomical issues politely described as less than ideal. Forget that infections, malnutrition, and lack of understanding plagued both sexes. If a baby didn't appear, people glanced sideways at the bride. The dread that medieval women carried wasn't just about discomfort. It was a dread of being held responsible for something they couldn't control. Their bodies were treated as political instruments rather than sources of selfhood. Let's continue drifting. Now towards something even stranger, the legal implications of a failed wedding night. If the marriage wasn't consummated, the union could be annulled. Some couples found this loophole extremely convenient when they realized they disliked each other. Others used it as a weapon. There were cases in which husbands refused to consummate the marriage just to remove their wives from political inheritance. One nobleman even claimed, with great solemnity, that he had been struck by divine impotence. Convenient timing. In another case, a bride publicly accused her husband of inexperience, and he retaliated by demanding witnesses to defend his honor. Imagine being a court clerk forced to listen to the details of that argument, and all because the wedding night had gone poorly. But perhaps the most tragic stories involve brides who were far too young. A girl of 12 or 13 was often married, but was not expected to consummate until later. Unfortunately, not everyone respected that boundary. A few husbands insisted on proceeding immediately, and chroniclers wrote these events with chilling neutrality. These young brides dreaded their wedding nights not because of social expectations, but because of real physical danger. This fear formed a dark undercurrent beneath all the more ceremonious traditions. Yet in the midst of this darkness, there were still small pockets of agency. Some noble women negotiated for time. Some asked for older female relatives to stay with them, acting as buffers. Some cleverly postponed the wedding night by claiming illness, which may have been one of the few acceptable lies of the medieval court. When a princess fainted dramatically at the doorway of her bridal chamber, no one questioned her sincerity. They simply fetched cold water and delayed the ordeal. Softly now, let's return to our broader idea. Why medieval women dreaded their wedding nights. It wasn't the act alone. It was the scrutiny, the expectations, the fear of failing a role they never chose, the uncertainty about the man standing in front of them, the inability to say no, and the knowledge that their lives would be measured by what happened in a single room lit by candles that never burned evenly. And with that, we begin to drift toward the next ripple in this long river of royal marriage customs. Because while the wedding night was dreaded, what followed could be even stranger. Consummation was only part one. Married life brought its own labyrinth of rules, expectations, and oddities that shaped a woman's destiny just as deeply. Before we slide into that next topic, I'll leave you with a soft question, something light enough to float on your thoughts. If you were a medieval bride facing this strange, overly public ritual, what would you have done to make the night a little more bearable? Tell me in the comments whenever you're awake again. Shall we drift onward? Let's drift quietly onward, still floating to the long, tangled corridors of medieval marriage, where expectation, duty, and silence form the walls. By now, we've wandered through the rituals, the fears, the gossip, the church-approved awkwardness, and the painfully sincere misunderstandings that made medieval wedding nights something women brace themselves for rather than anticipated. And as we ease deeper into the world of noble households, the air turns even softer, swept by candlelight and the rustle of linen curtains. Life after the ceremony moves slowly, like a river half asleep, and yet it had a pull strong enough to drag a young bride into a life she never quite chose. After the wedding night faded, assuming her husband had recovered from the ail, the nerves, or the sudden discovery that he was expected to perform, medieval women entered a new kind of daily vigilance. Not dramatic vigilance, just the quiet, exhausting kind. The kind where every breath was measured against expectations. Her first task, unspoken but universally understood, was to prove fertility. No one said it aloud in the first few weeks, because everyone was pretending to be polite, but it lingered in the hallways like an unwelcome guest, humming inside the heads of in-laws and chambermaids. When she ate too little, someone whispered. If she ate too much, someone whispered even louder. If she looked tired, well, obviously that meant something. And heaven forbid she made the mistake of yawning. Someone's aunt would interpret that as a sign of early pregnancy and immediately start planning baptismal robes. Meanwhile, the husband often had the confidence of a terrified rabbit disguised as a nobleman. Medieval men were taught many things. How to hold a sword, how to drink like they were auditioning for a Viking raid, how to negotiate land disputes while aggressively pretending to be calm. But what they weren't taught was how to communicate anything. Not affection, not nerves, not apologies, and certainly not how to ask, in a gentle whisper, whether their new wife was perhaps feeling overwhelmed by being handed the duties of a full estate before she'd had time to locate the bathroom. This produced the most awkward, muted domestic dynamic imaginable. The couple would sit across the breakfast table, both deeply unsure what to say, nibbling bread that tasted suspiciously like anxiety. She'd glance up, he'd glance down. She'd smile politely. He'd stare at his cup as though it contained the secrets of the universe. And when an older relative asked, "So, how was your first night together?" both would simultaneously forget how language worked. Eventually, though, routines emerged. Medieval noble women didn't exactly have the freedom to discover themselves, but they found small ways to settle in. Some immersed themselves in embroidery, which was considered both respectable and safely quiet. They stitched flowers, saints, borders, patterns, and occasionally, in moments of private frustration, the medieval equivalent of sarcastic doodles hidden between the threads. Others learned the estate accounts, because if there was one reliable truth, it was that noblemen preferred to spend money, while noble women were expected to figure out why the treasury was somehow empty every spring. And then, of course, there were the lessons in managing servants, which required more political skill than half the royal courts in Europe. But beneath all this everyday activity, the question of the wedding night never vanished. It only stretched itself thin and wrapped around the couple's life. If the bride had not conceived after several months, though the timeline varied depending on how nosy the family was, the pressure came in subtle waves. Someone would send her a charm to wear, because apparently a piece of tin shaped like a fish was going to solve everything. Another relative recommended certain herbs, most of which tasted like regret. Then there were the people who advised baths infused with rose petals, honey, or whatever plant they'd found growing outside their window that morning. By contrast, if she did conceive early, the tone shifted instantly. Everyone became overjoyed, except the woman who actually had to carry the child. Suddenly, she was expected to glow with gratitude, while also avoiding any activity more intense than existing quietly. Even embroidering too vigorously was considered dangerous by some. She was told not to climb stairs, not to lift anything, not to walk too far, not to sneeze with too much enthusiasm. In short, she was turned into the medieval version of fragile cargo. Her husband, thrilled and terrified, hovered awkwardly. He didn't know what to do, so he usually did nothing, which somehow made things harder. Yet even pregnancy wasn't the end of the story of why women dreaded those first nights. Because medieval pregnancy came with its own anxieties, illness, superstition, church warnings, old wives' tales, midwife gossip, fasting rules, saintly blessings, and absolutely no medical knowledge whatsoever. Everything was blamed on everything else. You ate onions? That explains the baby's temperament. You prayed to the wrong saint? That's obviously the reason for morning sickness. You slept on your left side? Well, now the entire universe is upset. In this corridor of endless pressure, medieval women carried emotional weight that rarely made it into textbooks. They weren't simply awaiting childbirth. They were navigating a web of marital expectations, in-law diplomacy, ritual modesty, religious scrutiny, and the quiet hope that their husband would eventually learn that affection didn't have to be awkwardly delivered like a tax notice. Meanwhile, husbands continued to do what husbands of time often did: try their best while remaining beautifully, hopelessly confused. Many of them genuinely cared for their wives. They just didn't know how to show it. Others cared mostly about producing an heir, because their fathers insisted on it, and their fathers' fathers insisted on it, and the family ghost probably insisted on it too. Still others were too busy managing wars, feuds, tournaments, or their own fragile egos to understand that their bride was living every day under microscopic scrutiny. As nights went on, the couple learned each other's rhythms. Not romantically, necessarily, just practically. He discovered she disliked drafts in the room. She discovered he snored like a carpenter sawing wood. He learned she preferred warm wine instead of cold. She learned he put his boots in the exact same place every night, as though setting a territorial boundary around the fireplace. These small understandings built the quietest kind of companionship. Not passionate, not poetic, just steady. Some couples eventually grew close, finding comfort in shared routines. Others remained formal acquaintances who happened to share a bed. And some, frankly, drifted through their entire marriage like sleepwalkers, gentle, polite, and entirely disconnected. But regardless of the outcome, each of these marriages began with that same mixture of dread, uncertainty, and obligation that hovered over the wedding night. Let's drift a little deeper, to the ways young brides found solidarity. Women talked. Quietly, of course, because being too honest was a direct route to scandal. But cousin sisters and trusted friends exchanged soft confessions. One admitted she had cried from fear on her wedding night. Another confessed she had been too embarrassed to speak at all. Someone else shared that her husband had been so nervous he tripped over the bedpost. They laughed gently, not out of cruelty, but because laughter was one of the few tools available to them. In those hushed circles of shared experience, medieval women found a kind of fragile power, a reminder that none of them were alone in the confusion of duty and expectation. What makes all of this strangely tender is that despite the dread, despite the pressure, despite the awkwardness, many medieval couples eventually found ways to make their lives livable. Some discovered friendship. Some found true affection after years. Some bonded through shared tragedy, shared children, or shared exhaustion. And yes, some remained distant forever. But the human tendency to adapt, to find warmth even in a cold, ritual-bound marriage, remained steady across centuries. And as we drift gently toward the next part, let your mind rest on that quiet thought. Medieval wedding nights were not simply one moment of fear. They were the beginning of an entire life built on navigating expectations, whispering hopes, and managing the strangely humorous, endlessly complex world of noble marriage. Before we float on, tell me softly in the comments, would you have survived the pressure of medieval expectations, or would you have quietly packed your bags and run toward the nearest forest? Let's drift back into the dim corridors of the medieval castle once more, where our unfortunate newlyweds are still trying to figure out what exactly they've signed up for. In the last part, we wandered to the quiet fears that women carried into marriage, the uncertainty, the lack of guidance, the rather unhelpful lessons offered by older relatives who basically said, just close your eyes and think of your dowry. And now, we gently float onward into the next dimension of all this, the world of medieval husbands. Because while medieval women dreaded the wedding night, many medieval men weren't exactly prepared for it either. In fact, some of them were so deeply unprepared that it almost feels unfair to blame the women for their anxiety. Imagine being told your new husband was raised by monks, had the emotional vocabulary of a stone, and probably believed babies were assembled by angels overnight, and then being told to go procreate with him immediately. It feels slightly unreasonable. Medieval husbands often entered marriage with just as many misconceptions as their young brides. A surprising number of them had spent their youth in monastic schools, which you might assume would make them serene and wise. But no, these were the same institutions that taught boys that women were either dangerously tempting or dangerously fragile, both of which led to some spectacularly awkward wedding nights. Many husbands had no idea what normal romantic interaction looked like. Their models were scripture, the occasional questionable poem, and maybe a traveling minstrel whose stories were not meant to be taken literally. Some poor boys believed that marriage was essentially a holy duty performed with the blank enthusiasm of a student completing an exam. Others thought it should be more like the love stories in chivalric romances, where knights fell in love instantly and everyone spoke in poetry. Unfortunately, both approaches led to disappointment. Now imagine the scene. A young husband, convinced he must behave like a gallant knight, enters a room and attempts to recite love poetry he barely remembers. Meanwhile, his bride, who has been told horror stories by her married cousins, is wondering if she should pretend to faint just to delay the inevitable. And so the two of them sit awkwardly on a bed big enough to house a family of geese, try to figure out who is supposed to do what, and whether closing the curtains counts as privacy when three attendants are standing nearby pretending not to look. The fact that anything happened at all is honestly astonishing. Of course, some medieval husbands arrived at wedding night with a very different kind of, let's call it, experience. Wealthy men of the era sometimes visited brothels long before marriage, though not necessarily with much success. The brothels themselves were often run like chaotic boarding houses with little structure, less hygiene, and exactly zero romantic atmosphere. So while these men technically had experience, it was rarely the kind that translated well into marriage. Their brides expected perhaps gentleness, maybe warmth, or at least some level of conversation. Meanwhile, these men sometimes approached their wedding night with the finesse of someone trying to mount a horse that's already tired of them. Not ideal. This mix of inexperience and misguided confidence created a spectrum of wedding night outcomes, ranging from mildly uncomfortable to absolutely legendary in the worst way. Chroniclers occasionally wrote about the wedding nights of royals and nobles, because apparently people in the Middle Ages had the same amount of free time to speculate about other people's private lives as we do now. One such case involved a young duke who was so terrified of hurting his bride that he refused to consummate the marriage for months, claiming he needed to study the matter more thoroughly. His advisors, who apparently took their job descriptions far too seriously, brought him diagrams. The poor man fainted. The marriage eventually worked out, but one imagines that the wife found the whole situation both touching and slightly frustrating. Another infamous case involved a king who had been told growing up that women were delicate, fragile creatures who might literally fall apart if handled too boldly. As a result, his wedding night was such an exercise in caution that his wife reportedly rolled her eyes and asked him to please stop acting like she was made of glass. The king, humiliated, never recovered from the embarrassment, and they spend the rest of their marriage in an awkward dance of mutual misunderstanding. One can imagine medieval parents watching their children struggle through these early moments, sigh in resigned frustration. Because while today parents sometimes give awkward birds and bees talks, medieval parents prefer to say nothing and let the newlyweds figure out the hard way. Their logic was something like, "We survived, so they will too." Not exactly nurturing, but we drift onward. Let's return to the ladies for a moment. We often talk about fear, dread, and uncertainty, but there was another layer that deserves attention: the pressure to produce heirs. Medieval women weren't just expected to consummate the marriage. They were expected to get pregnant as quickly as possible, ideally before the wedding wine had even lost its chill. A wife who failed to conceive swiftly might be whispered about by relatives who had nothing better to do. Some blamed the woman, others blamed demons, because apparently demons were always involved in something. But very few people blamed the husband, no matter how unhelpful he might have been. And so, the wedding night became the starting point of a long, exhausting journey. Every cycle, every sign, every hope raised and dashed became part of the quiet background noise of medieval marriage. Women who didn't conceive quickly often developed a sense of constant self-doubt. Meanwhile, their husbands, confused but eager to maintain appearances, insisted that everything was fine even when it wasn't. This mismatch created emotional distances that lingered across decades. Then we drift one layer deeper into the strange rituals meant to encourage fertility. Some women were told to drink potions made of herbs and spices, which sounds harmless enough until you read the recipes and discover ingredients like eel blood or powdered pearls. Others were encouraged to pray to specific saints known for their miraculous intervention in matters of reproduction. And in the most extreme cases, usually among the very wealthy, couples were told to visit shrines where the relics of supposedly fertile saints were kept. One can imagine the awkwardness of kneeling in front of Saint's finger bone while silently hoping for a pregnancy. But the greatest pressure often came from the political stakes attached to noble marriages. A queen or duchess wasn't just a wife. She was a dynastic investment. Her children would determine alliances, inheritances, even the fate of kingdoms. So while the wedding night was personally stressful, it was also the start of a long period of national scrutiny. Chroniclers recorded whether queens conceived quickly. Nobles gossiped. Rival factions whispered. A queen who did not produce a son quickly might be blamed for everything from political instability to bad weather. This brings us to one of the strangest and most uncomfortable aspects of medieval marital life: the public involvement in private matters. We've touched on the bedding ceremony before, the part where newlyweds were escorted to the bed by half the castle staff. But the involvement didn't end there. Families often asked for updates on the couple's progress. Some husbands were pressured by their male relatives into boasting about their performance. Some wives were pressed for signs of success, which is just as unpleasant as it sounds. Privacy was a luxury few women enjoyed. And yet, despite all this pressure, many medieval marriages slowly transformed from awkward beginnings into gentle companionships. Not all, of course. Some remained formal alliances held together by obligation. But many couples learned to trust each other, laugh together, and support one another in ways that transcended the initial awkwardness. These relationships didn't appear in chronicles, because stability and affection were not considered newsworthy. Still, they formed the quiet foundation of many households. One particularly charming story involves a noble couple who reportedly began their wedding night in complete mutual panic. The groom tried to entertain his bride by telling her the story of how he once got stuck in a well. The bride then shared an equally embarrassing incident involving a goose. They laughed until tears ran down their faces, breaking the tension so thoroughly that by the following morning, the attendants outside the chamber were relieved to hear soft conversation instead of silence. Their marriage became one of the happiest recorded in their region. It's a refreshing reminder that awkward beginnings don't determine everything. And so, as we drift toward the end of this part, we settle into the understanding that medieval wedding nights were rarely the romantic fantasies depicted in modern period dramas. They were confusing, pressured, and often deeply embarrassing for everyone involved. Women carried fears inherited from generations of whispered warnings. Men carried misconceptions shaped by limited education and unrealistic expectations. Together, they stumbled into a complicated world of duty, tradition, and hope. Before we float onward, I'd love to hear from you. If you lived in the medieval world, what advice would you give a young couple about to face their wedding night? Whisper your thoughts in the comments below. And as we drift here at the end of our long, meandering journey through the dimly lit corridors of medieval marriage, with all its anxieties, awkward rituals, embroidered bed linens, unnecessary church supervision, unlucky bridesmaids, and occasional royal meltdown, it feels like the right moment to let the candles burn down to soft orange stubs and give your mind a chance to float. We wandered through the fears medieval women carried quietly into their wedding nights, the expectations placed on their shoulders, the myths whispered by older relatives, the political pressures that turned something intimate into something public, and the oddly ceremonial way entire households seemed determined to get involved in things that absolutely did not require audience participation. And through it all, we've stayed in that same quiet rhythm, slow, steady, peaceful, the kind of pace that lets your thoughts untangle. Maybe you learned something tonight. Maybe you drifted off halfway through. Honestly, either outcome is perfect. That's the whole point. If you're still awake, which would be surprising and mildly impressive, thank you for being here. Thank you for listening, for breathing slowly with the story, for letting the medieval world unfold around you like the soft creak of an old wooden door. You make these sleepy journeys worth creating. If you enjoyed tonight's slow walk to the past, feel free, whenever your eyes reopen, to tap the like button. It helps more sleepy wanderers find their way here. You can also subscribe if you want more calm, late-night history sessions drifting into your feed. And if you feel like sharing a thought before you fall asleep, I'd love to know which medieval detail tonight surprised you the most? Or maybe, which era should we drift into next time? Leave it gently in the comments whenever you wake. For now, rest well. Let the old world fade into whispers. And as always, good night, my friends. Sleep deeply.